The empath's quiet exit. The most brutal revenge of all. Have you ever witnessed someone simply vanish from your life without warning? Not with screaming, not with drama, but with something far more unsettling: complete silence. Today we're exploring one of the most psychologically devastating forms of separation, the empath's quiet exit. This isn't just someone leaving. This is the withdrawal of a soul that once gave everything. What makes this departure so uniquely brutal isn't the noise it creates, but the deafening silence it leaves behind. When an empath decides to walk away quietly, they're not just ending a relationship, they're performing what might be the most sophisticated form of psychological justice ever conceived by the human mind. Let's begin by understanding what we're really dealing with here. An empath isn't simply someone who feels emotions strongly. We're talking about individuals whose nervous systems are wired to absorb and process the emotional frequencies of everyone around them. They experience the world through an amplified emotional lens, often feeling others' pain as if it were their own physical sensation. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of human psychology, worked extensively with individuals who displayed these heightened sensitivities. In his clinical observations, he noted that these deeply sensitive individuals often became the emotional caretakers in their relationships, absorbing not just feelings, but the psychological burdens of those they loved. Jung observed that these individuals possessed what he termed psychological porosity, an almost supernatural ability to sense the unspoken needs, fears, and desires of others. But this gift came with a devastating cost. These same individuals often found themselves completely depleted, having poured their entire emotional reserves into relationships with people who took their sensitivity for granted. Now, here's where the psychology becomes fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. When an empath reaches their breaking point, something profound shifts in their psychological makeup. It's not a gradual change, it's more like a switch being flipped. One day they're the person who remembers your birthday, anticipates your needs, and offers comfort during your darkest moments. The next day, they're gone, completely, utterly, without explanation. This transformation isn't impulsive or emotional. It's calculated, deliberate, and rooted in a deep understanding of human psychology that most people never develop. The empath has spent years, sometimes decades, studying the person who hurt them. They know every emotional trigger, every insecurity, every way this person depends on external validation, and then they remove themselves from the equation entirely. Think about the psychological impact of this withdrawal. The person left behind suddenly loses their emotional mirror, their validation source, their psychological comfort blanket. But more than that, they lose the one person who truly saw them, understood them, and chose to love them anyway. The silence that follows isn't empty space. It's the absence of unconditional acceptance, and that absence echoes through every aspect of their life. Jung wrote extensively about the concept of psychological projection, how we unconsciously attribute our own thoughts, feelings, and motivations to others. In toxic relationships, the abusive person often projects their own emotional instability onto the empath, believing that the empath's love and attention is something they're entitled to, rather than something precious being freely given. When that projection suddenly has nothing to bounce off of, when the empath simply vanishes, the abusive person is forced to confront the reality of who they actually are without that emotional buffer. It's like removing a mirror from someone who spent their entire life believing they were beautiful, only to discover they've been looking at a reflection of someone else's soul. The timing of an empath's departure is never accidental. They don't leave during the dramatic peaks of conflict, when their departure might be explained away as emotional reactivity. They leave during the quiet moments, when everything seems normal, when their absence will be most keenly felt and least easily understood. This strategic timing serves a psychological purpose. It eliminates the possibility of narrative control. The person left behind can't tell themselves, they left because they were angry, or they left because of that fight we had. They left because they chose to leave. Period. There's no external circumstance to blame, no dramatic incident to point to. Just the devastating realization that someone who once chose to stay has now chosen to go. The empath's quiet exit also involves a complete cessation of what Jung called psychological feeding. In toxic relationships, the empath unconsciously becomes the source of emotional sustenance for their partner. They provide validation, attention, concern, and care in endless supply. Their departure doesn't just remove a person from someone's life, it removes their primary source of psychological nutrition. Imagine someone who spent years being hand-fed, suddenly finding themselves completely alone with their hunger. That's the psychological landscape the empath's departure creates. The person left behind doesn't just miss them, they begin to psychologically starve without the constant emotional sustenance they'd grown accustomed to receiving. But here's what makes this form of separation so uniquely devastating. The empath doesn't engage in any of the behaviors that might provide closure or understanding. They don't send angry texts. They don't seek revenge through mutual friends. They don't post cryptic messages on social media. They don't engage in any behavior that might give the other person something to react to, something to blame, something to understand. They simply become unreachable. Not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. It's as if they've erected an impenetrable barrier around their entire existence. Phone calls go straight to voicemail. Messages remain unread. Mutual friends report that they seem fine, happy even, but they simply don't mention the person who's desperately trying to reconnect. This complete emotional unavailability creates what Jung identified as a psychological vacuum. The person left behind finds themselves screaming into a void, seeking validation from someone who has removed themselves so completely that they might as well have ceased to exist. The silence doesn't just hurt, it's psychologically destabilizing. Jung observed in his clinical work that individuals with narcissistic tendencies often struggled most profoundly with this type of withdrawal. Their entire psychological framework depends on having others react to them, engage with them, validate their existence through emotional response. When an empath withdraws completely, it threatens the very foundation of how these individuals understand themselves and their place in the world. The narcissistic person begins to question everything. Were they ever really loved? Was the relationship real? Did they imagine the connection they felt? The empath's silence provides no answers, no closure, no way to process or understand what happened. It's psychological purgatory, being trapped in uncertainty without any hope of resolution. Meanwhile, the empath is often experiencing something entirely different. After years of being emotionally depleted, of giving endlessly without receiving, of having their sensitivity exploited rather than cherished, they're finally free to direct their emotional energy inward. They're not seeking revenge in the traditional sense. They're reclaiming their psychological autonomy. Jung wrote about the concept of individuation, the process by which a person integrates different aspects of their personality and becomes whole. For empaths who have spent years defining themselves through their relationships with others, the quiet exit represents a radical act of individuation. They're choosing their own psychological well-being over someone else's emotional needs, often for the first time in their lives. This process of reclaiming their emotional energy often leads to what appears to be a complete personality transformation. The person who once was available at all hours, who remembered every detail of your life, who anticipated your needs before you expressed them, suddenly seems like an entirely different human being. They're not angry or bitter. They're simply living as if the relationship never existed. This transformation can be particularly devastating for the person left behind because it challenges their entire narrative about the relationship. They believed they were dealing with someone who was emotionally dependent on them, someone who needed them as much as they needed the empath. The discovery that the empath can simply choose to stop caring, stop remembering, stop being affected by their absence is psychologically shattering. Jung observed that this type of complete emotional withdrawal often triggered what he called a psychological crisis of abandonment in the person left behind. They begin to realize that what they interpreted as weakness, the empath's sensitivity, their willingness to forgive, their endless capacity for care, was actually a choice. And if caring was a choice, then not caring is also a choice. And that choice has been made. The person left behind often goes through a predictable psychological progression. First, there's disbelief. This person who loved them so deeply, who was so connected to their emotional world, couldn't possibly just stop caring. They convince themselves it's temporary, that the empath is just processing and will eventually return. Then comes the desperate attempt at contact. They try every possible avenue to reach the person who's withdrawn. They call, they text, they show up at places they know the empath frequents, They reach out through mutual friends, through family members, through social media. Every attempt is met with the same response. Nothing. Not anger, not acknowledgement, not even rejection, just silence. This silence begins to eat away at their psychological foundation. They start to question their own memory of the relationship. Did they imagine the depth of connection they felt? Were they delusional about how much they meant to this person? The complete absence of any emotional response begins to make them doubt their own sanity. Next comes the bargaining phase. They begin to acknowledge that they might have hurt the empath, and they desperately want to make amends. They craft elaborate apologies. They promise to change. They try to demonstrate that they understand what they did wrong. But these attempts at reconciliation disappear into the void, unacknowledged and unanswered. The psychological impact of having your attempts at reconciliation completely ignored cannot be overstated. When someone screams at you, at least you know you've been heard. When someone rejects your apology, at least you know they've considered it. But when someone doesn't acknowledge your existence at all, it creates a unique form of psychological torture. Jung noted in his work that this type of complete indifference was often more psychologically damaging than active hatred. When someone hates you, they're still emotionally invested in you. Their hatred confirms that you matter enough to generate strong feelings. But when someone becomes completely indifferent to your existence, it suggests that you never mattered at all. The empath's quiet exit forces the person left behind to confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves and the relationship. They begin to realize that their perception of the empath as someone who was emotionally dependent on them was completely backward. The empath wasn't staying because they were weak or needy. They were staying because they chose to love someone despite that person's flaws. And if they could choose to love unconditionally, they could also choose to withdraw that love completely. This realization is psychologically devastating because it removes all the comfortable narratives the person had constructed about the relationship. They can't tell themselves that the empath was too emotional, too needy, too dependent. They can't blame the empath's departure on psychological instability or inability to handle conflict. The empath's complete composure during their withdrawal demonstrates a level of emotional control and psychological sophistication that many people never develop. The person left behind is forced to confront the possibility that they were the problem in the relationship, not because they were evil or malicious, but because they took for granted something precious that was being freely given. They treated unconditional love as if it were an unlimited resource, never considering that it might one day be withdrawn. Jung observed that individuals who experienced this type of abandonment often went through a period of intense self-reflection that could either lead to genuine personal growth or complete psychological breakdown. The determining factor was their willingness to accept responsibility for their role in the relationship's demise. Some people use the experience as a catalyst for genuine change. They begin to understand that emotional sensitivity isn't weakness, that care isn't obligation, and that love isn't ownership. They develop a deeper appreciation for the rare individuals who choose to love unconditionally, and they learn to reciprocate that love rather than simply consuming it. But others find the psychological implications too threatening to accept. They create alternative narratives that allow them to maintain their existing worldview. They convince themselves that the empath was mentally unstable, that their withdrawal was proof of psychological problems rather than psychological strength. They tell themselves that anyone who could leave so completely must have never really loved them in the first place. This defensive reaction, while psychologically understandable, prevents them from learning the lessons their experience might teach. They miss the opportunity for growth that the empath's departure could provide, instead choosing to remain in patterns that will likely repeat with future relationships. The empath's quiet exit serves as a mirror, reflecting back the true nature of the relationship that existed. If someone can walk away from you completely and find peace, joy, and fulfillment in your absence, what does that say about what they were experiencing in your presence? The silence becomes a statement more powerful than any argument, any explanation, any confrontation could ever be. The most psychologically sophisticated aspect of the empath's quiet exit is its completeness. They don't leave room for negotiation, for gradual reconciliation, for slowly rebuilding trust. They create a clean break that forces everyone involved to accept the finality of their decision. This isn't a temporary separation or a dramatic gesture designed to get attention. It's a permanent life change. Jung wrote about the concept of psychological death and rebirth, the idea that sometimes we must allow certain aspects of ourselves or our relationships to die completely in order for something healthier to be born. The empath's quiet exit represents this type of radical psychological transformation. They're not just leaving a relationship, they're killing the version of themselves that tolerated being undervalued and unappreciated. For the person left behind, this finality can be more difficult to process than traditional forms of relationship ending. When someone leaves dramatically, there's often hope that the drama might eventually subside and reconciliation might be possible. But when someone leaves quietly and completely, they're communicating that the relationship isn't worth the emotional energy required to fight about it. This message, that you're not worth fighting for, not worth being angry at, not worth the emotional investment that conflict requires, can be more psychologically damaging than any insult or criticism. It suggests that you've been weighed, measured, and found so lacking that you're not even worth the energy it would take to hate you. The empath's withdrawal also eliminates what Jung called triangulation, the process by which toxic individuals involve third parties in their conflicts to gain validation and support. Because the empath doesn't engage in any drama, doesn't share their story widely, and doesn't seek sympathy or support in processing the relationship's end, there are no allies for the person left behind to appeal to. This isolation compounds the psychological impact of the abandonment. The person can't gain closure by having friends confirm that they were wronged, or by having family members validate their perspective on what happened. The empath's dignified silence extends to their entire social network, creating a wall of indifference that can't be penetrated or circumvented. Perhaps most devastating of all is the gradual realization that the empath is not just surviving without them, they're thriving. Reports from mutual friends suggest that the empath seems happier, more peaceful, more energetic than they've been in years. This contradicts every narrative the person left behind has constructed about their importance in the empath's life. The discovery that someone you believed needed you desperately is actually better off without you is psychologically annihilating. It forces a complete reevaluation of your understanding of yourself, your relationships, and your impact on others. It suggests that what you thought was love might have been possession, that what you thought was care might have been control, and that what you thought was connection might have been consumption. Jung observed that this type of psychological reckoning could be profoundly transformative for individuals who were willing to sit with the discomfort it created. The complete absence of external validation forces people to develop internal sources of self-worth and psychological stability. Without someone else to blame or fight with, they're forced to confront their own patterns and behaviors. But this transformation requires a level of psychological courage that not everyone possesses. It's easier to create stories about the empath being damaged or unstable than to accept that their withdrawal was a rational response to being consistently undervalued. It's more comfortable to blame their departure on their oversensitivity than to acknowledge that sensitivity was a gift that was taken for granted. The empath's quiet exit forces everyone involved to confront the difference between conditional and unconditional love. Most people believe they understand love, but they're actually familiar only with transactional relationships, where care is exchanged for validation, attention is traded for security, and emotional investment is expected to generate specific returns. When someone loves unconditionally, truly loves without expectation of return, their sudden withdrawal reveals just how conditional everyone else's love actually is. The person left behind realizes that their love was contingent on the empath's continued availability, continued forgiveness, continued willingness to absorb their emotional overflow. When that availability is withdrawn, their love reveals itself to be more like emotional dependency. The empath's ability to simply stop engaging, to withdraw their care completely and redirect it toward their own well-being, demonstrates a level of psychological autonomy that many people never develop. It shows that their previous devotion was a choice, not a compulsion, and that they possess the emotional strength to make difficult decisions when their well-being is at stake. This revelation can be particularly devastating for individuals who saw the empath's previous devotion as evidence of their own worth or desirability. They believed they were special because someone with such capacity for love had chosen to focus that love on them. The discovery that this same person can choose to withdraw their love completely suggests that they're not actually special at all. They were simply the recipient of someone else's conscious choice to care. The psychological aftermath of an empath's quiet exit often extends far beyond the immediate relationship. It changes how the person left behind approaches future relationships, how they understand love, and how they evaluate their own worth. Some people emerge from the experience with a deeper appreciation for genuine care and a commitment to reciprocating emotional investment. Others become more guarded, more suspicious, less trusting of emotional connection. Jung believed that every psychological crisis contained the seeds of transformation, but only if the individual was willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to understand what it was teaching them. The empath's quiet exit creates exactly this type of crisis. Uncomfortable enough to demand attention, but subtle enough to require deep self-reflection to understand. The most profound aspect of this entire dynamic is that the empath's withdrawal isn't motivated by hatred or desire for revenge in the traditional sense. They're not trying to hurt the person they're leaving, they're trying to save themselves. Their silence isn't calculated cruelty, it's self-preservation. Their indifference isn't punishment, it's protection. But the psychological impact on the person left behind can be more severe than any intentional act of revenge could create. The empath's commitment to their own well-being, their refusal to engage in drama, and their complete emotional unavailability creates a void that nothing can fill. It's not just the loss of a person, it's the loss of a way of being in relationship that they may never experience again. In the end, the empath's quiet exit serves as both ending and beginning. For the empath, it's the beginning of a life where their emotional energy is directed toward people and experiences that appreciate and reciprocate their care. For the person left behind, it could be the beginning of genuine self-awareness and personal growth, or it could be the beginning of a pattern of relationships characterized by emotional superficiality and defensive barriers. The choice belongs entirely to them, just as the choice to leave belonged entirely to the empath. And perhaps that's the most brutal revelation of all, that in the end, we are all responsible for our own psychological well-being, and no one else is obligated to absorb the consequences of our emotional choices. The silence speaks louder than any words ever could. The absence teaches more than any presence ever did, and the peace that follows might be the most honest thing that ever existed between them. That's the empath's quiet exit. Not revenge in any traditional sense, but something far more sophisticated and psychologically devastating. It's the withdrawal of a gift that was never recognized as precious until it was gone forever. Now, I know this resonates deeply with many of you watching right now. You've either experienced this profound silence yourself, or you recognize someone in your life who simply vanished without explanation. The psychological impact we've explored today isn't theoretical, it's lived experience for millions of people navigating complex relationships. This understanding changes everything about how we approach emotional connections. It reveals the true cost of taking someone's care for granted, and it demonstrates the incredible psychological strength required to choose your own well-being over someone else's comfort. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Share this powerful phrase, "Silence speaks louder than words ever could." This simple statement captures the essence of what we've discussed today, and it will help others who need to hear this message find their way to this content. Your comment becomes a beacon for someone else who might be struggling to understand their own quiet exit or processing someone else's departure from their life. The psychology behind these relationship dynamics runs deeper than most people realize. When you truly understand these patterns, you develop the ability to recognize emotional manipulation before it damages you, and you gain the strength to protect your own psychological well-being. This knowledge becomes your shield against those who would drain your emotional energy without reciprocation. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're building more than just a playlist. You're developing psychological literacy that will transform every relationship in your life. Each video in this series provides another piece of the puzzle, another tool for understanding human behavior at its most fundamental level. Your subscription tells the algorithm to share this life-changing content with others who desperately need these insights. And make sure you like this video, because that simple action amplifies this message to reach someone who might be sitting in silence right now, wondering why they feel compelled to disappear from their own life. Your like could be the catalyst that helps another person understand their own psychological patterns and find the courage to prioritize their emotional well-being. The next video we're preparing will reveal something even more psychologically complex: the hidden signs that someone is about to execute their own quiet exit, and the unconscious behaviors that predict this type of withdrawal weeks or even months before it happens. You'll discover the subtle psychological indicators that most people miss completely, the early warning system that operates below conscious awareness. This isn't just relationship advice. It's psychological intelligence that gives you the power to understand human behavior at levels most people never reach. The patterns we'll explore next will fundamentally change how you read people, how you recognize your own relationship patterns, and how you protect your emotional energy from those who would exploit it. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because this next revelation builds directly on everything we've discussed today. The psychological sophistication of what we're about to uncover will give you insights that typically take years of therapy to develop. You won't want to miss a single detail of what's coming next.